Hello everyone, a very warm welcome to all participants. This is the webinar series, Transparency and Accountability in Public-Private Partnerships. And this is the second webinar of the series, and the topic is creating a framework for public-private partnerships disclosure. I am Shyamala Shukla, Senior Consultant to the World Bank Group Public-Private Partnerships. As most of us who have worked on we need to get the PowerPoint up. Yeah. As most of us who have worked on public-private partnerships understand, transparency and accountability in PPPs is a wide area, and disclosure is just one small part of it, but an important part. And it is also connected with the other tools that we have, audit, and then we have other accountability checks like the Fairness Auditor. We did a webinar last week on this subject of Fairness Auditor and disclosure of reports of the Fairness Auditor. It's something which is very important, and you know what's happening in terms of the other accountability mechanisms when these are disclosed. So disclosure is something which is related. It's a small part of accountability and transparency, but it kind of overlaps all the other mechanisms and is an important and underlying part of everything that has to do with public-private partnerships, the entire process from when the project starts to the expiry of the contract term. So we will look at this topic today, and we will present a draft framework for disclosure, which we have been discussing, and we would look forward to feedback from the participants at the end during the question answer session. Please forgive us for this PowerPoint, the format that you see. Due to some technical hitch, we are with each slide we also see the top of the next slide. Please bear with us on this. First of all, looking at global trends and trying to connect these with a framework, what we see now is that there's a lot of questioning on whether PPPs are the right way to go and the most appropriate way to go, or should other more traditional forms be brought back once more. And this is a question that is being asked in countries which have large PPP programs and are on their way to more mature programs. And increasingly governments are under pressure to share information, and they're also making an effort to come out with more information about the PPP process. In terms of challenges, we see that while governments are bringing out more information, there are few examples of systematic disclosure, and there's a disconnect. The objective of disclosure is something else, but you achieve something else through your policy. So the policies are not totally geared towards achieving what the government set out to achieve while disclosing. And there are also a lot of unintended consequences, like disclosing at the wrong time, or disclosing information which is which should have been confidential, or disclosing excessive information which people cannot access. There could be several unintended consequences. To look at a few examples, like the World Bank has worked quite a bit, and we will look at that. However, to look at a few examples of what the global trends are like, we have here on this slide, which you see, some extracts and some details of or highlights of work which has been done in countries. Looking at India, this is an example of reactive disclosure under RTI, but it has consequences for proactive disclosure as well. And this is a CIC, Chief Information Commissioner decision from 2012, where public-private partnership was defined as a public body, and within the ambit of public authority in the RTI Act, seeing that there's a certain degree of government control in functioning. There is a contract, and then there are contributions from the government in terms of funding and other support. And therefore, such public bodies coming within the RTI should be disclosing information. That was for reactive disclosure, but as you know, the RTI Act in India also provides for some amount of proactive disclosure, although it leaves the details to the authorities to um, determine what they should be disclosing. So it's not a very clear kind of concept. And looking at a small country like Honduras, which has a small PPP program with only a few projects which have reached financial close, this country has joined the COST recently, and there is discussion within government that we should, and within Kulyanza, which is in the nature of a PPP unit, to disclose more information. And our World Bank country office has suggested that we have a Spanish version of the draft framework given the country level interest so that they can see what is the potential out there in terms of better disclosure. In Colombia, which is way ahead of many other countries in terms of disclosure, policymakers are looking at making this disclosed information, which is vast, much more accessible to people. And if you look at the United Kingdom, which is of course a pioneer in terms of disclosure in PPPs, along with some other Australian jurisdictions. In the UK, we see from the 2010 policy and the PF2, which came later on, that now the government will be putting out quite a lot of information. There will be pipeline information, you will have project tracking, full contract disclosure in all the PPP contracts signed after January 2011, and full financial information where the government has equity. And one of the bigger highlights, I would say, is that the UK will also be giving out information on returns, actual returns, where there is government equity involved. So this is actually a trend which needs to be followed and seen what happens as we go forward. I give you an overview just to glance at it. I won't spend much time on this of the work of the World Bank Group in this area of disclosure. Right now we are on dissemination activities, and this framework is a way to disseminate what we have seen is our good practices being followed in different countries. And we have tried to keep this framework very controlled in the sense that disclosure should not impose such a cost on the authority in terms of time, effort, and even money that it becomes a problem. So we have kept this within the ambit of whatever reviews we have done. You see the last box, pre and post procurement disclosure review, which we carried out earlier in 2011, 12, and 13, which covered just the post-procurement, but later on the pre- and post-procurement disclosure covered 13 jurisdictions, which also identified some specific good practices, and we looked at proactive disclosure only. So we have tried to link all of these practices with the disclosure guide or framework, as we call it. Another issue while creating the framework, which we kept on the top of our agenda, was to align whatever framework of disclosure we suggest or we try to come up with the objectives of disclosure. Why do governments want to disclose, and why do the public and other stakeholders want the government to disclose information in PPPs? And an overarching theme from our consultations with the countries, both clients, people in the public sector, decision makers, policy makers, and practitioners, as well as private sector practitioners, CSOs, during the course of this review, as we consulted with them, the overarching theme seems to be reducing the risk of corruption. And there are other themes which kind of overlap with this, like increasing private involvement in infrastructure services, increasing public confidence in both the services as well as what the government is trying to achieve through PPPs. And for the government, from the government side, we saw that it was important to ensure value for money. It's not all governments that do value for money assessments, but they do assess public-private partnerships in some way. They evaluate PPPs in some way to make sure that this provides value for money for the government. So we tried to bring all of these principles into play, and we tried to look at what could result in increasing private involvement. And you see the bullet points there. The private sector wants the pipeline to be predictable. They want the tender process. They want to know what the tender process will look like before the tender process, before they go through it. And they want clarity on what type of project it is, as much information as the government can put out on the kind of project they are bringing out into the market. And they want that everyone should be treated equal. So all firms have a fair chance, and it's not just a tick box exercise where things have been determined beforehand. It has to be a process which is fair to everyone, and whatever modifications happen during the process are known to all. So these are the kinds of things that the private sector seems to be looking at from our consultations. And when you come to the public, general public, including the users, they want to know what the project is going to give them in terms of services, and how, what has been agreed. And when they look at the project at the operational stage, they want to know whether what these actual service levels being achieved are, and whether they match, what has been promised. And if there have been changes in tariffs, they want to know why. Will they get something better for that? And what exactly went into making the tariff, the basis of the tariff, the fundamentals of that. They want to know the cost to the government. Is it affordable to the government? And what kind of returns is the private sector getting? Because there are all sorts of support mechanisms built into PPPs, and people want to know whether this support is, actually more for the service, or is it some way of giving windfall profits to the private sector. So they want to feel reassured. In terms of the government, as I said, they want to be sure they're transferring proper risks to the private sector, which the private sector is better able to manage, and the government payments and commitments are affordable. And in terms of renegotiations, again, this information needs to come out so that general public as well as everyone involved knows that these renegotiations continue to provide a value for money. So bringing all of this in, we have tried to have a recommended template for disclosure and a suggested framework. The framework is by no means perfect. It is just the beginning, and it's something we will call a draft for a long time, as we take feedback from a wide variety of stakeholders and others who are interested in this area, and we'll continue to make changes and look for some level of perfection, although such things can never be perfect, and they have to be dynamic and have to keep changing, looking at what's happening out there in the PPP world. So this is the draft disclosure framework outline. This is how it looks right now, and although we cannot, it's detailed, it's pretty detailed, and gives a lot of information that practitioners working in this area are trying to prepare a disclosure framework, and again trying to operationalize it would like to know. But here I just give you the detail. Part 1 basically looks at preparing the ground and looking at what should go into a framework. What we have talked about now, for example, the challenges and why should people disclose, who are the users of information, and what are the objectives and what should be the objectives of disclosing information. And part 2 is the basic framework. We start with having a basic design, and then from the basic design we go into the details of each part of it. Like we will come to it later on, and you can see it on the slide in front of you. We look at every aspect of disclosure that any practitioner would have to deal with as he goes through this, the implementation or thinking through of that policy. Part 3 is basically, this is a tool in terms of, these are little tools which will help the practitioner who's actually working on PPP disclosure. There's a disclosure diagnostic, and we'll come to it later on. And we've also provided a glossary of terms, because a lot of practitioners in countries who start working on these issues may not be either aware of the disclosure terms that are the disclosure jargon, as we call it, which is being used, or the PPP terms that are used. So we've provided that for the very basic user. And we also have resources and references and other websites where they could go and look at different designs and practices in different countries and use those. Coming to the elements in the design of disclosure framework, uh, I would like to say at the outset that not all of these elements would be useful for every country, and not everyone needs to do it this way. But these are some of the elements which, if they exist within a disclosure policy, they make it easier to institutionalize, easier to operationalize. And for that reason, we have this, whole, as you see, um, different areas or different elements that we think should be included. And in this, we have at the top as an overarching environmental, or as you call it, environment that should exist within the FOI legislation. So an FOI legislation is important for proactive disclosure, but it's not something that has to be there. And if it applies to contracts, it's also something which is very useful. Then we come to PPP legislation. A lot of countries have it, some don't have it. So based on that, one could go ahead and think what to have in which type of legislation, FOI or PPP. And under that legislation, we have looked at the finer aspects. Where should we have them? We can't have the details in legislation, nor should we have too many details in the legislation. So we come to PPP policy, or even in a few countries, we have the PPP disclosure guidelines. In fact, I can think of one right now. There's a Canadian province which has come up with guidelines for information disclosure, a legislation for information disclosure in PPPs, which is very interesting. So it's higher than the policy or guidelines even. Guidelines, of course, a lot of countries do have. We have British Columbia guidelines. We have guidelines elsewhere, such as in Alberta. These are two provinces of Canada, and then we have such guidelines elsewhere also in the UK. And the draft policy of India, we have guidelines for disclosure, and we have these in a few other countries. These guidelines could go into more details. And then something we found from our reviews was that there is guidance on confidential information in a few countries. Some countries do not have much of a concept of confidential information, especially in the Latin American countries, and they try to put out as much information as they can, as they possibly can, without overwhelming everyone. But there are a few other countries where there is such confusion on what is confidential information that they tend to leave out essential items of information. And what they do disclose doesn't actually end up meaning anything for any of the users of the information. So that's an area where there has to be guidance for officials in any policy which claims to be whole or meaningful. And in terms of tools which can make life easier for the officials involved in PPP disclosure, we think standard clauses on disclosure in different documents during procurement stage and even in the contract document would help a lot. And these could refer to legislation, policy, or these could be standalone. Like if you're missing FOI legislation, PPP legislation, or even PPP policy in some countries, and you're doing some standalone projects, and the contract drives the project, and in those cases the standard clauses become very, very important, and they clarify a lot of issues for the private sector as well as the public sector. We have also talked about a template. This would also make life easier for the practitioners, in the sense that the template would make disclosure in projects much more uniform, and people would know what to expect, and people can within the government would know what to put out, and they would not need to rethink everything each time. For legislation, there has to be some thought on what you put in legislation. Basically, you have to enable disclosure generally, which is what FOI legislations do, and it's good if they enable proactive disclosure and provide a mandate for that with a broad listing of elements, but we don't even need to go into the broad listing of elements. And FOI and PPP legislation could throw some light on what could be considered confidential information. Commercially sensitive is something which we look at in several FOI legislations. Strategic and public interest has also been the a common strand in some of the FOI legislations. So that could be the content, very limited content within the legislation. But when we come down to more detailed issues which legislation cannot provide, we come to guidance, PPP disclosure guidance. But under this, we think that we should have the linkage to the mandate provided under the FOI Act. Sometimes the application to PPPs is not very clear, and disclosure guidance, which is separate, can clarify that mandate which has been provided in the FOI Act. And this could also, the guidance could also deal with the elements which should be disclosed proactively, the place of disclosure. It could look at timelines, when should information be disclosed, each element of information, when should it be disclosed, and the treatment of confidentiality has to be explained in detail inside such guidance. And one needs to go beyond the highlights or headline issues of this. Validation is another issue which could be dealt with in the guidance, whether to have external or internal validation. Who would be responsible for signing off before the information becomes public? And would there be provisions for audit of the information, either prior or post, or random or a full audit before it goes out? And some guidances do provide detailed templates, a user-friendly template with ease of data aggregation, something one would be looking at. And I have had a lot of feedback on this. People have asked, why do you need FOI legislation? Why do you need PPP legislation to talk about this? This could be done through contract. And I do agree, it's not a prerequisite, and FOI acts are not a uniform feature, but it makes life easier. And in our review, we found that countries which have FOI acts, they also put out a lot more information about PPPs in the public domain. And there seems to be a very strong correlation from the small sample of projects that, the countries, jurisdictions that we have studied. And we cannot say that these two are going together. It might just be that countries where there has been more thinking on putting out more information and where there's a higher level of sensitivity about governance and transparency also go in for FOI acts in the first place, and therefore there's also more of the other information, and it's just a general culture. In terms of pre-procurement disclosure, this is actually a very important part. What we have seen and what we propose in the framework is that at pre-tender stage, some amount of information is expected by the private sector and should be there to provide more of certainty and for people to know what they should be prepared for. At this stage, we think that the approved pipeline and a brief description of the project, whatever there is at that stage, should be put out. So, and tentative procurement dates, what is the kind of, what are the timelines that these projects are going to follow? What is the government plan for these? And a second distinct stage in pre-procurement disclosure is that of tender documents. The tender documents that, and we also saw that for the tender documents and evaluations, these three stages that we were looking at, there is a lot of information in many countries on the tender documents, but at the pre-tender stage, there are few pipelines, or there's not much predictability that these published pipelines denote, and there's not even much information at times beyond the names of the projects. So that needs to be improved quite a bit, and therefore we have put in some details in the framework, and we have suggested that a little more information should come out at pre-tender stage. In terms of tender documents, we feel that it's good to have the EOI, RFQ, RFP, which is that should be accessible to all and not just to people who register, or especially at RFP stage probably shouldn't be only for those who have been shortlisted, but should reach a wider audience. There are views on both sides on this. The draft contract is something we do think should be put out. There are again various views, and if you see in Latin America, a lot of countries are putting out draft contracts, not so in some other countries, where a plea is taken that it would compromise the negotiating position of the government in future projects. I'm not sure when these same countries go ahead and do publish their full contracts online, how it can create problems for future projects. But then that's the viewpoint that I have heard of and discussed often with practitioners. And in terms of evaluations, again, which is the third distinct and important stage in pre-procurement disclosure, we have seen that there is little information disclosure. A few countries are non-uniformly, publishing the names of bidders, shortlisted bidders, and sometimes you even have the ranking which comes out at the end. And of course, the name of the preferred proponent is always, it always comes out. And minutes of bidders meetings, it's good for these to be put out, because they give a lot of information about what went into the decision making, and it helps people understand that it has been a fair process and some thought has gone into it, objectivity has gone into it. And modifications made to the document during the tender stage, they can create an aura of secrecy, or they could create the feeling that everything has been transparent, depending on whether you put out information of every modification you have made or whether you conceal it. Because in many cases I've seen through the tender process, as we proceed through the tender process, we really don't know what modifications have been made, what evaluations have been done, how the government has reacted to feedback from the public or feedback from the a sample of the bidders themselves. So this information should come out to create an overall feeling of transparency, and also it makes a real difference, material difference to how bidders approach a project. Reports, if there are oversight reports, they should be put out. And for VFM reports, however, we say that these should be put out following financial close, given that this keeps changing and these reports are kind of dynamic because the figures change till the financial close. On unsolicited projects, we have the case of Colombia, which puts out feasibility reports, and we thought it was a good practice because unsolicited projects are sometimes like, totally closed. Nobody knows what happens, and there are transparency problems around a lot of these unsolicited projects, basically because the competitive process is either limited or not there at all in most cases. Then we come to post-procurement disclosure. And in this, I would say that we have to think about the entire project operational phase, starting from the time when the contract is signed, then you go into construction, you go into commissioning, and then you go into operations, and then there's also at the end the expiry of the contract when you take back the project or project assets, and what happens at that point of time is also very important. And during the operations phase, you also have the issue of renegotiations and changes which happen. So all of these should come out into the public domain. And for this, we have certain areas which we have looked at. For example, basic project information, which would be high-level information. And we talk about risk, value for money, which comes in, like I said, after financial close. So it's pre-procurement information, but which is disclosed in the post-procurement phase. Some financial information which makes which has an objective, in the sense that I talked earlier about the objective of disclosing actual equity returns and estimates and actual revenues earned, especially where there is a kind of risk, sharing. There's a lot of risk sharing which falls on the government, and especially where there's a revenue share, some of this information should come out. Government support about the guarantees, it's and the grants or any other rights. It's important in terms of government's own, how fiscally sustainable is the project, the government's ability to pay, and what is the government paying, and what is it getting in return. So this information should come out. Tariffs and service we have discussed before. This is something which is very essential to build confidence among the public, and therefore we have said that there has to be transparency around the methodology, regulation of tariff, the actual service levels, and the provision for penalties. What happens if service levels are not being met? In major contracts which are concluded as part of all the major contracts which form part of the project, as you know, the project is not just one contract but consists of multiple contracts. We feel that all of these should preferably be put out. And then we come to the most important part and the most neglected part also. And this is the monitoring of performance. In our review, we found that while a lot of the countries have now started putting out either contracts or contract summaries, and a lot of the information, a lot of static information which you find at the time of contract signing, which you have at the time of contract signing, US government end up putting it out, and that information is available. But after the project is the contract is signed, or sometimes after construction and commissioning, you just don't know. It's a whole blank space out there. So monitoring of performance and putting out actual performance reports against the targets is very important. We do have independent engineers and auditors in many of these projects. What we should look at is to ensure that all of these reports come out. And user feedback surveys and surveys, if any, third-party surveys, these should also come out. And what's the use of this? It's important that projects continue to provide value for money, and unless we see that they are performing according to agreed levels, we can never be sure that there is VFM in a project, because as you know, financials change, everything changes as projects progress. We also feel that contract termination clauses should be very clear to the public in general, and this should be put out at the time of contract signing. And the redactions we have already talked about, and the renegotiations and changes. The details of changes with dates and clauses should always be put out, and that's very important. We will now go to confidential information in a little bit more detail than I have spoken about so far. And confidential information, we can have a few levels of making this clear in any disclosure framework. First, you have the very high level provisions in law, which we have already talked about. And Preferably, it should be combined with the presumption of full disclosure. Like, unless there is a real case for, not putting out a certain piece of information, it should be out. The whole contract should be out unless there's a very strong case. And going beyond the law, where you can only have a high level talking about, say, commercial sensitivity or public interest issues, in guidance you have to actually go step by step. And as I said, the problems in having, the lack of guidance is creating a lot of problems in disclosure. And we suggest that in terms of confidential information, we should have provisions and guidance which will help officials to, from the initiation, to think about commercial in confidence clauses. When should they start thinking, and whether they should take the provider's opinion, whether they should talk to the private sector about it, when they should begin to negotiate. And appropriately, it's at RFP stage that this negotiation should start in terms of provisions in the RFP, so that the private sector knows what will be confidential and what will not be, and then also comes back with its feedback and specific projects in case there are specific reasons for not putting out certain pieces of information. And in terms of commercial sensitivity, we have to go down below what exactly is commercial sensitivity. Is it affecting revenues, earnings, and the ability of the provider? For example, it could be something which is very specific to that provider, and he doesn't want that to come out into the market. Unit costs and loan prices, etc. This could affect a private provider, and if there is a case for not putting out this information, it should be designated as confidential information. But on the other side, we have the public interest, and this should also be weighed. And where there is public interest in putting out information, this should kind of override some issues of commercial sensitivity, depending on the weight of each. And how should officials look at this? Because this could be different for different, projects. Therefore, this guidance has to be provided, and some examples have to be provided, maybe from past projects or projects in other countries. There could be some benchmarks for this. And in the guidance, you could have a, format in terms of how to go ahead with this. In standard contract provisions, we could connect with FOI once again, connect to the language in the FOI and the specific elements and how they relate to that, to a project contract. And the audit mandate should be very well clarified here, because as you know, some of the audit reports come out into the public domain, and they tend to bring out certain pieces of information which are otherwise not available. So this should be very clear to the private party that at the time of audit and when the audit report is made public, some areas of sensitive information might come out. And base case financial model, that's something which a lot of, I have probably not seen too many of these. So base case financial model is never put out into the public domain, and there's a little bit of a debate going on about whether they should be put out and whether there's anything in the base case financial model which should not be put out. But that's something which we still think is under debate, and we are not recommending that it should be put out. And we are also recommending that every country have some standard clauses. We've tried to give information in terms of the framework on what these standard clauses could look like. And here I have again the same, it repeats. In the standard clauses, you have to have the same content. You have to give the entire picture of what your legislation looks like, what your confidentiality provisions look like, and what disclosure in the public interest could be. So all of these should have place inside the standard contract clauses. In the disclosure framework, we have also tried to have a template. I have not put out the template. It's a 3.5 page template. We tried to make it as simple as possible. We tried to make it dynamic. I won't present the entire thing here because it's a repetition in terms of the elements which we have seen so far in pre-procurement and post-procurement disclosure and the confidentiality elements. So we've tried to put all of that together and bring it into the template. And we've tried to make it dynamic in terms of the changes in the data which will happen from time to time depending on what stage the project is in. And we've looked at the data aggregation perspective and therefore put the performance information in a certain format where data on several projects can be aggregated and in some common fields, and aggregated information can be put out. We have tried to divide it into sections, having an intuitive. It's an intuitive way of how would a user who's looking at that information want to look at it. So we have made some sections based on that kind of thinking. How would the user or the reader like to go through the template? And however, this template needs to be customized because we have thought and tried to make it broader, looking at a lot of contracts while preparing the template. We went through a lot of contracts in a number of countries, and we have provided some technical assistance to Nigeria and India in a few contracts, and there we have read through these contracts and tried to see how different sector contracts can be information about different sector contracts can be put out in these using this template, and therefore it's broad, but at the same time it needs to be customized for very different projects or for projects with certain specific information. And we have tried to make it user friendly. What we suggest is that it should be, all information should be published on a common platform as far as possible. A public procurement portal or a PPP unit portal, an SPV website in addition can be used, but the links should go from a common place so that one doesn't have to look all over to get the information. In our reviews, we found in most of the countries we had to go all over and look at a number of sites and talk to a number of people before we could get some meaningful information about a single project. And we studied 5 projects at least in every jurisdiction to see how uniform the disclosure of information was, and we found a lot of non-uniformity, and we found that the information was not displayed in a user-friendly manner, and it was in bits and pieces everywhere. So that can be prevented by having one place from where all the links can go. We could have the project pipeline, and from there, from the listing of the projects, we could go to different documents. We could have a web-based project or contract summary in template, and it could have links to different reports. We could categorize the documents in terms of contract or procurement, and under contract we could even categorize it further. So we have tried to put in all of these elements which I have discussed so far into the template, and also have a place for the amendments and renegotiations that come later on. If any of you are interested and would like to send me an email about looking at the template, we would be very happy to share that template also. And last of all, this is the last slide, and I'll quickly go through it so that we can take a few questions. We have a disclosure diagnostic as one of the tools, as I mentioned initially. It's a part of the framework that we are discussing. And we have seen that a lot of countries, for example, when we were talking to policymakers in Kenya about not too much information being in the public domain, they spoke about actually looking at what enables disclosure in the country and many other policymakers also came back and said we have to first look at what enables disclosure. What does our FOI Act say? What does our PPP legislation say? What can we put out? And what else do we need before we can go ahead and start putting out more information? So we created a disclosure diagnostic where either countries or organizations which are working in countries in the area of disclosure can do a diagnostic and test where that country stands in terms of disclosure. So in this we have a few parts. We have a preliminary overview where we can have a history and outlook on PPP disclosure and do a look at newspapers, or we can look at other media reports. We can look at what information is there on different websites. And then we have something which we call the rapid review, gap assessment, and then creation of a framework. And in rapid review and as well as gap assessment and creating a framework, in all three, we have tried to look at 4 categories: politics as it affects disclosure, both positively or negatively; law as it affects disclosure, again negatively or positively; what kind of guidance there is, are there gaps in guidance; and then looking at templates, which are the final enabling or the last link in terms of creating a more transparent environment around PPPs. So this disclosure diagnostic will take people to or practitioners to a stage where they know what they have to do, what are their gaps, and how they can create a framework. So this is a tool which we have created, and this will help people to get to a stage where they can start looking at making a framework for themselves. I have taken a little bit more time than I thought I would in the presentation, and we will now start looking at the questions that we have. We have a question from Akhu Akolo, and it's basically a statement, I think. I can see EOI and RFQ, then RFP. Is this a 3-stage process? I thought EOI exercise could achieve the same output. Yeah, you're right. You're right. It depends, actually. Some countries actually do just an RFQ and an RFP, and there's no EOI. And sometimes the EOI and RFQ serve the same purpose. So people have an EOI and then they go to an RFP. So this is, as I said, we have to customize all of this, and there could be even a 1-stage process in some places, though that's not very common nowadays anymore. So we will have to customize this to whatever kind of PPP process that countries follow. Stephen Gall has a question. It would be interesting to add some of the post-procurement disclosure elements to the PPI database, particularly the forecast and actual equity returns. Yeah, that's we would all be happy if that happens, and it'll give us a lot of data to look at the way PPPs are working. And right now, the kind of lack of transparency that surrounds many of these projects, especially in the operational phase. We do know when the project comes out that okay, we have all of these elements, but once the project starts operating, we really don't know what's happening. So it's always good to know all of this, but this is we are really behind in this in terms of forecast and actual equity returns. We don't have that kind of information, and perhaps the United Kingdom is the only country which has now, according to their PF2, have put this out that you should disclose forecast and actual equity returns where there is government equity involved. And hopefully other countries will also go ahead and try to put that in. And once we have this kind of information coming out into the public domain, then at that stage it might be possible to add this to the PPI database, because after all, the PPI database also cannot access anything which is not available. You have James McDonald has a question. Are there open data standards for PPP? So that one can more easily compare different projects. The World Bank has a governance global practice, which is looking at these, open contracting data standards. They have this OCDS. And now what they're doing is trying to look at extending those OCDS into other areas, into specific areas or specific sectors. And PPP could be one such sector. So we haven't really started working on that, but that's a very great question, and I think we need to do more work on that. And we are now in the very early stages of discussing how we could do it. And another question from James is, do you think such standards should be promoted in international agreements, legislation, regulations, policy, and or contracts? Yeah, we think so, and the suggested framework for disclosure is a first step. And at some point of time, we can think of this as standards, but right now there is no such, we don't have standards which have to be not in the same way as we have, environmental or other standards, or we don't have that for disclosure. But I'm hoping we will have that soon. And just to give a bit of piece of information, we are also working towards trying to disseminate this to more countries, and we have some organizations which have asked us for this disclosure framework and for information on the practices which are being followed in different countries. So probably at some point we will get ahead and we will get to that stage where we promote such standards in international agreements or legislation. Anand Srivastav is asking a question. We have difficulty in getting the copies of BERs and PQER in India. How can we obtain this? Anand, could you, write out the full forms of BER and PQER? I've worked for a long time in PPPs in India, but somehow I'm having difficulty. Okay, bid evaluation report, all right. Okay, and you could also write this, you could write the full form of the PQER also. What evaluation report is that? So the bid evaluation report, pre-qualification evaluation report. Okay. From what I saw in India, they were putting out information of the minutes of meetings, evaluation meetings. I came across a couple of them. I don't know if this is kind of, non-uniform. Some department or organization or ministry has just put it out by mistake or maybe deliberately, and they wanted to put it out. But uniformly, I guess you could try asking them for it under the, what do you call it, RPI. It won't be proactive disclosure probably. We are saying that these evaluation reports should be put out. But in terms of the procurement legislation in some of the countries, I don't know if they will put out information on the detailed evaluation, the detailed scoring that they did for each of the bidders. I think that is information that is not supposed to come out in some of the countries. So India might have some such problems. Try doing it in RTI and check. So that's one way of doing it. I believe that a lot of people have got a lot of information through the RTI Act in India, which has not much in terms of which doesn't call too much as confidential information from all the CIC decisions that I have been reading. But in many cases, you have to try a lot before you get the response. Or that's my understanding. Now that we are at the end of the questions and also at the end of the time that we have for this. Okay, we have another last question. I'll answer this and then I will get to the end of this presentation. Jamila Costa is asking, are you having some type of awareness sessions on PPP disclosure in some countries? We are trying to have consultations with countries, and in 2012, we discussed PPP disclosure. We brought out our 2013 publication after that. We have distributed it to countries. We are in dialogue with some of the countries who are interested. And in a lot of the learning material that is going out from the World Bank, we are trying to have either a section or on transparency and accountability with disclosure as a part of it. So we are trying to do it in those ways, like put it in your learning material which you have, and then if you have a conference in a country, talk about transparency, accountability, and disclosure as a part of it. So we have been doing awareness sessions, not maybe totally dedicated to PPP disclosure, but sessions, PPP sessions with PPP disclosure as a part of this. Jan Schunoven is asking, what role do you think PPP units have in this process? I think PPP units have a very large role in this process, and we need to put that information inside the framework, and we are planning to do that. And it's there in a way, but it's not kind of highlighted. I think PPP units have to everywhere take a lead in this. They have a kind of, I feel it's not a very clear mandate, because PPP units on the one hand have to facilitate. They are seen as leaders of the projects, and sometimes they hesitate to put out too much information, because the people who do also tend to make mistakes, and they don't want those mistakes to come out. So there's that kind of an agitation and also a hesitation in putting out more information in PPP units. But on the other hand, progressive PPP units themselves in many of the countries we reviewed have taken on the onus of putting out more information. So I think PPP units would have a great role in creating such frameworks and in trying to get this framework into place. Now we are at the end of our time. Thank you very much to all who participated today.